Good Yontif, everyone. You know, let's face it, these high holy days are bizarre. Who would have ever thought a year ago at this time that we would be conducting our high holy day services in this way? Life is truly unpredictable. It seems that we're on the cusp of completely different things in the world. We potentially have a vaccine that's coming, God willing. We have an election coming. It's possible we're entering into a chapter where, again, we don't know what the world is going to be looking like. We have no idea. And so with this in mind, this is going to be a theme that I'm going to be tracing through all of our high holy days this year. It's how do we spiritually prepare ourselves for a world that we can't even imagine what it's going to look like in a few months? What are the tools that we can use that are at our disposal? Where can we find strength to meet the coming challenges and opportunities that lie ahead? That's what I'm going to be talking about this year. So first of all, when we look around at our society right now, I think there's one thing that we can all agree on. There are many people in this country, there are many people in our society and around the world that you and I maybe want to clobber right now. There are all kinds of people who we can't believe that they're planning on voting for who they're voting for. We can't believe that they support who they support. We can't believe that they are willing to attack those whom they attack. There are countless people in our country and in our world right now whom so many of us have lost all respect for, and that is an incredibly painful and difficult reality that we have to deal with. So what do we do now? That's the perennial Jewish question whenever we are confronted with difficult times and difficult challenges. What do we do now? Well, I'll tell you, we can turn to our tradition and we can find all kinds of beautiful wisdom, teachings, and statements. All Israel is responsible for one another. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. They're beautiful statements. The problem is, when you think about these wisdom statements and golden rules, they tend to start to break down in the year 2020 when you look at people in our society and they want to vote for someone who you might believe wants to take away your rights or the rights of those whom you love. When you see people in your society who seem to want to attack the stranger, what do you do? How do you love the stranger if the person who you're looking at in your own society is somebody who seems to have made a deal with the devil? Indeed, you shall love your neighbor as yourself is an incredibly important teaching, and we better get to the bottom of what that really means. That's what I'm going to talk about today. What does love your neighbor as yourself truly mean? We need to understand that right here and right now on this Rosh HaShana, because our whole future really depends on our living by the truth of that teaching. So in Leviticus 19:18, you have the famous line. It says, "You shall not take vengeance or hold a grudge against your fellow, v'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, ani Adonai, I am God." So on the surface, it seems like a pretty straightforward commandment from God. You should love your neighbor as yourself. That seems pretty understandable. But if it's perhaps too vague or too general for you, we have other ways of explaining it in our tradition. We have the famous teaching of Hillel that many of us know, who turned the idea upside down on its head to make it clear. And he said, that which is hateful to you, don't do to the other person. That's a nice teaching. That might be helpful. But again, in 2020, I look around and I wonder how useful that is. When I see people voting for somebody who I think they should not be voting for, okay, I won't do that. I won't vote that way. If I see somebody walking by me in a crowded street and they're not wearing a mask, I won't do that. I will wear a mask. Does that really address the issue? It was Nachmanides, a medieval commentator, who finally came out and said, you know, on its surface, love your neighbor as yourself is kind of impossible to fulfill when you really think about it, if you just look at it on its surface. He said, because when you look around at human nature, you might notice that as wonderful and loving as so many of us are, at the end of the day, most of us want to put ourselves before others. It's simply a natural human tendency that we put ourselves first. And if you don't know if that's true, even Rabbi Akiva famously taught when he brought this subject into the realm of Jewish ethics. He said, in the ultimate nightmare situation where you have to choose between saving your life and the life of somebody else, according to Jewish ethics, you have to save your life first. That might be a very difficult thing for us to hear, but actually we're all familiar with this, because when you've ever gotten on an airplane and they're giving that instruction about those oxygen masks coming down, what do they tell you to do? Put it on your own face first before you help your kid, because that's the only way you have the potential to save another life. So at the end of the day, we put ourselves first. So Nachmanides explains, what does v'ahavta l're'echa kamocha mean then? He says, it's all in that Hebrew letter lamed, l're'echa. You should love to your neighbor as yourself. He said you should wish for your neighbor. Pray that your neighbor gets the blessings that you would want for yourselves. That's very lovely. Again, I apply this to our current period of history, to the year 2020, and I look around at people who are voting or behaving in certain ways that I don't like, and I might wish for them something that I have for myself. May you have the education that I got, that you can understand what I understand. May you be able to have more compassion in your heart the way that I have striven to have more compassion in my heart. Do you see the problem with this? If I'm wishing something like that on somebody else, I'm still being entirely disdainful of the other person. I am thinking myself better than that other person. And when there is disdain, there isn't real love. So I can wish something to somebody, but I have to really love them as an equal first. So still, we don't have an answer to what it really means. If there's this command in the Torah to love your neighbor as yourself, what does that mean? We get a brilliant answer, and I think this one nails it on the head, in recent times from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks in England. And I think he solved the problem. He taught it in the following way. He said, if you really want to understand a verse from the Torah, you don't really ever look at that verse in isolation. You have to look at it in its wider literary context. And he said, yes, only one time in the Torah does it say you shall love your neighbor as yourself. However, he points out, no less than 37 times in the Torah, you are taught that you must love the stranger as yourself. So only once do you love your neighbor as yourself, but you love the stranger as yourself 37 times. This is a brilliant point to make. And it's true. Just a few lines after it says, love your neighbor as yourself, it then says, v'ahavta lo kamocha, you shall love the stranger as yourself. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. Because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So what does this mean? It means, well, yes, we're told that we have to love our neighbor as ourselves. That's a beautiful thing. But that really stands as a reflection of the much broader and much deeper teaching in all of Judaism, that our real job as the Jewish people is to love the stranger, the person who is different as ourselves. It's easy to love your neighbor who's like you, but much more difficult to love the stranger who is not like you. Let me unpack this a little more. The role of the Jewish people for thousands of years has in many ways always been as the stranger in the world. Just as it says, we were strangers in the land of Egypt. That is basic, primal, definitional of what it means to be a Jew in the world. Going back to the times of ancient Egypt, the world has looked at the Jewish people and never entirely fathomed us, right? Our role is always to be other, to be different, a little bit on the outside of the mainstream of humanity. And that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. Because as the Jewish people, as those who stand a little bit outside the mainstream, we have the gift of being able to look into the mainstream and to morally evaluate it and to critique it, to bring the gift of our perspective on everyone else, on all of humanity, and to bring the gift of our vision of how the world can be better of how this world can heal and become a better place. So what does this mean in our own interpersonal relationships in 2020? Bear with me. So at some point, all of us are going to have to come into contact with people who have made choices or done things that we feel are anathema to who we are, to our basic beliefs. And at such a moment, what do we do? So I believe the force of our tradition, when it commands us to love the stranger, what it's telling us to do is in the moment when you meet that person, you might on some level see them as an enemy, but take a deep breath. Now, I'm not talking, by the way, about coming into the presence of a psychopath or a murderer or a terrorist. That's a whole nother sermon. I'm talking about coming into the presence of somebody who maybe you might see, another American, maybe they're even a member of your family. As we know, many families are divided bitterly over the future of this country. What do you do then? You take a deep breath, and you go inside, and you find the most Jewish part of your neshama, the part of you that has always been the stranger, the part of you that once upon a time frightened the Egyptians and that continues to frighten other people because of our difference in the world, to inhabit that place where you know what it is to be other, and then to look across at that other human being and see the otherness in them. And in that moment of being aware of your otherness and seeing the other person's incomprehensibility to you, let there be a silent joining between the two of you. This is a very spiritual insight, a joining in your otherness in that moment. Because in that joining, I'm not saying you have to suddenly agree with them or condone their choices, but there's a joining, a silent spiritual joining, an equalizing that is a beginning, even potentially to understanding, empathy, and compassion. You know, in the Jerusalem Talmud, there's a discussion of this mitzvah of loving your neighbor as yourself. And they focus not on that line, but on the words that come right before it in the same line. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your fellow. And the Jerusalem Talmud explains what that means. It says it's like if you're on the cutting board and you're chopping food, getting ready to cook, and your knife accidentally cuts your hand and you bleed. What do? Do you then take the knife and attack the hand that cut you and caused you to bleed? No, of course not. You are united. You are both those hands. So why is the Talmud teaching us this? It's saying that the things that make us think that we're separate from each other are only superficial. Really, ultimately, we're united. We are one so much more than we can possibly realize, and we discover that by encountering each other's otherness. Again, what does this mean for us? It means that if you think you understand somebody based upon choices they have made or other behaviors that they have had, if you think you really do know their story, if you really think you know their reasons or their path, think again. It's only in the moment that we begin to realize that the other human being is completely beyond our ability truly to understand. Because every human being is infinitely more deep than we can ever know. Only in that moment, when we realize that, that's the beginning of all humility. That is the beginning of all possibilities for goodness and for healing. I'm going to give you an example of how this played out in my life, and it's a negative example. I not long ago got into a conversation with somebody who was concerned about the fact that I was speaking out very vocally in light of all of the demonstrations that were happening about Black Lives Matter. And I came out very strongly saying the Jewish community must affirm Black Lives Matter at this moment in history. And this individual was very concerned that I was asserting this, given the fact that there are people who are leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement who are anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. And indeed, of course, he's right, there are. And this eventually became a very bitter argument, and I'll tell you why. Because at one point in the conversation, this person said to me, you know what, I believe that all lives matter. As soon as I heard him say that, something within my heart shut down. I closed down completely to that person, and I raised my voice and I said, that is racist. And as soon as I said that to him, he had some choice words back to me. And the entire conversation broke down at that moment. It was a horrible conversation. Because in the moment that I heard him say, all lives matter, I immediately reduced him to all of the ideas I had about the kind of person who could say all lives matter at this moment in history. I reduced him entirely to somebody less than me because he felt that he could say something like that. That, to my mind, was so offensive. I saw him as less than. And in that moment, he ceased to be an equal in a conversation between him and me, and he became an enemy. Now, needless to say, I was deeply shaken by that experience. And probably the thing that shook me to my core the most is that I didn't practice what I'm preaching right now. That I didn't have the tools to not react from anger and rage and belittling, right? And I got very still with myself when I reflected on this terrible experience. And I realized something. I realized that in that moment, and I'm only talking about that moment, the moment that I lashed out and labeled what he said as racist, in that moment that I did that, in a sense, because of my tone and how I said it, I was no different than the bigot that I was accusing him of being. Now, why would I say that? Because in the moment that I lashed out with my tone of voice and my words, I was treating him not as an equal. In a sense, I was seeing him as less human than I am. And I was inherently disdaining him in that moment. Now, what does a bigot do? Let's think about it. They don't treat other people as equals. They dehumanize other people, and they do violence to other people, as I did with my words and my tone of voice. That made me no different than any bigot in that moment. So the question I now ask myself is, what would have happened if I had been able to practice what I'm preaching right now? What happened if I really were inhabiting that place of loving the stranger as myself in that moment? Well, then in that moment, as soon as I heard him say, all lives matter, that thing that was so anathema, in that moment that suddenly he appeared as entirely other to me, what if I realized, as my Torah teaches me, that the otherness of another human being obligates me to that other person? It obligates me to find a way to bridge the divide. What if I practiced that? What would I do? I would take a deep breath, and instead of saying, that's racist, I would have said, okay, so you think that all lives matter. Tell me more. Tell me more why you say that. Explain to me what brought you to this understanding of the world. I want to understand. Tell me your story. Tell me how you feel about your life and the world around you that brought you to this place. What would happen if I had approached it that way? It would have been a completely different thing. It wouldn't have broken down. It would have been an opportunity to connect with another human being and maybe to learn from each other and to grow together. Because if I actually think the statement all lives matter is wrong, I never got a chance to actually communicate why. In this way, perhaps we could meet each other and understand. And it could have become a moment of blessing and a moment of healing. Now, I know that what I'm teaching, as I'm showing you, is easier said than done. It's probably the hardest thing we'll ever have to do, but I think we're all going to have to do this in the coming weeks and months and years ahead in this society. It's not that it's impossible. It really is doable. There are incredible stories out there in the world. The story, for example, of Derek Black, who was from this neo-Nazi family, or elite family of neo-Nazis in this country. This young man, and he went to college. And when he went to college, the Jewish kids in his college kept inviting him to Shabbos dinner. And you know what happened? Eventually, after inviting him again and again to Shabbos dinner, he transformed. He ceased to be a neo-Nazi. He became a Judeophile, and he's now fighting against bigotry and hatred in this country. There's the story of Daryl Davis, who's a black man, who made it his business to personally befriend as many members of the KKK as he could. And I'm told that 200 members of the KKK have renounced their membership because of the personal connection and outreach that Daryl Davis brought to their lives. It's possible. The Baal Shem Tov, the great founder of Hasidism, has a very beautiful teaching. He says, what does it mean that we're all created b'tselem Elokim, that we're all created in the image of God? Well, he explains, the word b'tselem is related to the word tzel. In Hebrew, tzel means shadow. That actually God is always acting as a shadow to our choices and our words and our actions. So when we are confronted with somebody who is completely other to us, if we move and act in the world with respect to them with an open mind and an open heart, then God shadows us and opens up infinite possibilities of blessing with that other person. However, if we close our minds and our hearts in the face of the other, then God shadows that as well, and all possibilities shut down. Very powerful words for this moment in history. That's what was at play in the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel in Genesis. Remember that story? The story goes that Jacob was about to meet up with his dreaded brother Esau, who he hadn't seen in 21 years, his mortal enemy. And the night before, he wrestles with this mysterious shadow figure, this angel. And they wrestle all night until the dawn, and he says to that shadow figure, I won't let you go until you bless me. And the shadow figure says, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Yisrael, for you have struggled with beings divine and human and have prevailed. And because he struggled with that shadow, that next morning when he met his dreaded enemy brother Esau, instead of war, there was love, there was healing. Suddenly everything opened up and they embraced as brothers once again. It's because the shadow, which was really God, opened up everything for him. Now in the months and years ahead, we are going to be confronted with a society where we have been taught and conditioned to see each other as enemies. That's the reality of it right now. If there's any message I hope you take from this sermon today, it's that this is the moment where on this Rosh HaShana, we have to go inside and struggle with the shadow within ourselves and to find the otherness that lives with us and to see that that shadow, that otherness is actually the place where we can most powerfully find the presence of God acting in our lives. And even more significantly, when we come into the presence of an other, a supposed enemy, and we look into their face and we look into their eyes, and we see a shadow of otherness, of the incomprehensible, I hope and pray that we can see in that shadow, in that otherness, none other than the potential presence of God. Because when Jacob met his brother the next day, he said, Ki al ken ra'iti et panecha kir'ot panei Elohim. Seeing your face is in fact seeing the face of God. May we each of us find the strength and the courage to confront the other in our society, to meet them for their otherness, and to transform that darkness and that shadow that we see in them into nothing other than the light and presence of God. And in so doing, may we transform our lives and our relationships, and may we make our society and this world a blessing for generations to come. And let us all say, Amen.